So Mina, we're going to get into a bunch of stuff about how you started your career, but a lot of people on this show talk about kind of their sports fandom and how that inspired them, shaped them. You're a well-known Seattle sports fan, so why don't you kind of start there in terms of how you became this diehard Mariners Seahawks fan?
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in Seattle. I should start by saying that. My dad was in the Air Force, which means I grew up in a million different places. We moved around a lot as a kid. I was born actually in Omaha, Nebraska, on Offutt Air Force Base, which is why I'm a Nebraska college football fan, kind of lapsed. But because of him, we just all, as a family, me and my brother, rooted for Seattle teams. We also would go back to Seattle in the summers to visit our family, go to baseball games there. But, you know, as a young kid, it was Mariners, Seahawks, Sonics before they left, and then UW football as well. And it was all really because of my dad sort of passing that down to us.
In my newspapers.com Mina Kimes search, we'll get into a couple of your early articles, but you did make second team all-conference soccer. And so give me your NFL player comp to Mina Kimes.
I feel
high
like
school soccer player.
That would be extremely ungenerous to any NFL player that I would come up with. I'll go with, I don't want to say Dan, but I think any player who maybe is more known for their after sports career more. I mean, it's like you said, I was second team all conference. I played soccer my whole life, so I'll start there. From when I was a young kid, played travel soccer all through the end of high school, and then I dropped it when I went to college. And I was pretty serious about it, but I was not that great.
What got you into writing?
That was something I was always into. Honestly, I can't remember. It's funny because now that I have a 2-year-old, I am like acutely aware of like when language kicks in and what it looks like at the beginning now in a way that I certainly didn't know beforehand. But I was writing as early as I can remember. I always loved writing. I loved reading, loved telling stories. My parents have scrapbooks full of just really unhinged stories I wrote as a kid. And then when I went to college, I knew I wanted to be involved in writing in some regard. I was an English major. I just didn't know exactly what that would look like. I don't think I knew in high school either, like what kind of writing I would be doing.
I saw that your internship that you got, because we'll get into obviously the business reporting part of your journalism career, but that it was kind of accidental that your internship was in business. So how did that all come about?
Yeah, I applied for a bunch of internship programs in college and got accepted to what was then Time Inc. Then it became Hachette. It changed a lot afterwards, but at the time it was Time Inc. And they had like a magazine internship program for for college students. But you didn't get to choose what magazine you interned at. So, you know, I thought maybe Time or Sports Illustrated or, I don't know, In Style. And they placed me at a magazine called Fortune Small Business, which I had not heard of, but also was an area that I had no interest in college. I didn't take economics or have any particular excitement about it. But, you know, internship was an internship. It paid, got me in New York. So I took it, and then I really, really ended up liking it, so much so that it was my first job out of college, was working for that very same magazine.
When it was your first job, what were some of your day-to-day responsibilities?
So at Fortune Small Business, I was actually writing profiles of small businesses at the jump, as well as like smaller pieces for the front of the magazine. I learned a lot, honestly, on the fly about really microeconomics, to be honest, but like just general business, how to read documents, how to read the numbers, what mattered. Learned a lot about policy affecting small business. And then only about a year into the job, that magazine shuttered. I was folded into a branded content business. And I made the decision, instead of staying there in the branded business, to switch over to a temporary job at Big Fortune, we called it, which was which is Fortune magazine. And my first job there was writing about finance, investing, actually. So I learned a lot very quickly about investing, stocks, the markets, at a time that was a pretty interesting time to be doing that because it was 2008. Yeah, I don't know how old you are. I'm like, oh, maybe that doesn't even mean anything to you.
No, I graduated college in 2010, so
Okay.
I'm full well about what the 08 to 2010 world was like.
Yeah, it was a very crazy time to be writing for Fortune magazine. Our offices in Time Inc. were right across from what was then the Lehman Brothers and became Barclays. But so, one of my early jobs, I've talked about this, that I remember was just trying to talk to people as they were leaving the building as the entire economy was collapsing. And really being a part of that magazine during that time was a crash course in learning about the markets.
I did find you were quoted in the Burlington Free Press because they were so excited that you wrote out about how Colchester was a great place to start a business and launch for CNN Money. Here's some Mina Kimes, some early print edition. Like many small New England towns, Colchester, located near idyllic Lake Champlain, offers easy access to camping, sailing, and great swimming. Reporter Mina Kimes wrote. So again, early days of the CNN. Well, I guess it ran on CNNmoney.com, which is why it got on there. But you brought up something earlier, which I was going to get into later in your career, because this is like what you did a lot of at ESPN was writing profiles. Here's what you liked about writing profiles.
Very different in sports from business. And, I actually didn't do that many in business. I did a couple early on of like investors who, at that time, it was less that I found them to be particularly interesting people or people that the public wanted to know about. It was more that they were involved in interesting things, whether it was, shorting entire markets or in lawsuits, things like that. Whereas with sports, the profiles were much more, okay, this person is already famous or is going to be really famous. Let me spend time with them and kind of figure out what makes them tick. So it was quite a different thing from, even though I think a lot of the same tools went into it and processes, the incentives or like the purpose of the profiles when I was a business journalist were very different.
Another clip that came up, and I'm going to fact check this here. Did you do a story for Fortune by going to the Amazon?
Yeah, that was Fortune Small Business, actually.
For Small Business.
Yeah, that was like a total boondoggle. Because I wrote about a small business that taught people how to, it was like a tree climbing business in the Amazon. So I went there for like a trip where we like practiced climbing really, really tall trees. It was that crazy story. I was like 23, I think. 22 maybe.
Well, it says, actually the clip came in the Omaha World Herald is where I saw it.
There you go. All right.
And then you went from Fortune to Bloomberg, correct?
That's right, yeah.
How did that work out, and why did you make that move?
Yeah, at that point, I guess it was like 2013 or 2014. I'd been at Fortune for a few years, and just kind of excited to try something new. The team that I was joining at Bloomberg did investigative reports, which was kind of the field of journalism I was interested in at the time. I did some investigative pieces at Fortune that I was really proud of and was really invigorated by. So, the opportunity to work with some Pulitzer Prize winning editors and reporters at Bloomberg was really exciting to me. I only was there for a year before leaving for ESPN, but I think it was just that. It was the investigative piece of that because Bloomberg was doing just great investigative journalism at the time.
Do you have a favorite story from your business reporting days?
Gosh. There's a story I did at Fortune about a company called Synthes that had been sued by people who had, some of them who had passed away, their family members, because of this bone cement that was put into their backs. And the story was kind of, this is the thing I really like to do with my investigative pieces, was just try to figure out what were the business decisions that led to these catastrophes and mistakes. My various first, I think, investigative story at Fortune was about Johnson & Johnson having a series of recalls. And it sounds kind of boring when you say it, but really they happened in large part because of cost cutting and mergers. And so I was always enjoyed like kind of getting inside companies to try to understand okay, what were the, not just that this happened, but why did it happen? Cost cutting is usually the answer, by the way. So that was one that I thought was pretty impactful and I was quite proud of.
Do you remember some of I got to imagine when you're talking to people at some of these companies at this time or doing investigative pieces, they're not the most forthcoming all the time. Do you remember having moments that were challenging where they'd throw obstacles in your way, not want to talk to you or challenge you on some of your reporting?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, I used to tell people investigative reporting is mostly just getting yelled at by lawyers, but also being told no. A lot of my process was just trying to contact as many people as possible who might know something, using those people to build networks to get to other people. But along the way, it's a lot of no's. You really have to figure out what would make someone or interest somebody in talking, because often, maybe if there's a lawsuit or whatnot, but often there's no reason for people inside companies to talk. You have to give them reason, whether it's deep knowledge of what's happening already, wanting them to, have a desire to give you the whole story rather than a piece of it. But it was a lot of cold calls, a lot of cold emails, a lot of trying to build these networks. It would take months just months at a time to build these cases, if you will.
Let's go to 2014. You have, I believe, was it a Tumblr where it started? Your blog that got picked up by Slate?
That's right.
Okay. So you write an essay on Tumblr about, the headline is Me, My Father, and Russell Wilson. And this is still, thank you to Slate for having an archive still. Mm-hmm. So many websites of your don't have them. It's a wonderful essay. And I'm just going to read this section where you get into your father and football. So my dad liked baseball, but he loved football. When I was small, I watched Seahawks games with him, sprawled out on the carpet near his feet. I absorbed his opinions and learned to worship his idols, Largent, Kennedy, Jones. He taught me how to complain about bad calls. Unless someone in the room is genuinely worried you're having a seizure, you're doing it wrong, and what to cheer for. Like most men of a certain age, my father is less impressed by flashy runs and diving catches than he is by players who fight for every last inch. Those scrappy warriors who lunge across the first down line, even as their ankles are dragged backward. What an effort, he'd cry. What an effort. What sparked that essay?
Yeah, so at the time I was still at Bloomberg. But, I was a business journalist, but I was spending so much of my time watching football and watching football, studying football, trying to learn about it. I was on the internet a lot, posting about it. And I think just being a writer, I kind of felt like this passion of mine was consuming so much of my time and also had affected one of my relationships in a deep way, which is what the essay was about. But I wasn't writing about it, right? I was doing what I described to you earlier, these investigative stories. And I remember just being on a flight and being like, I have all these thoughts in my mind in this story. Why not just write it down? And also it was fun to just write in a personal essay tone because, Bloomberg is a pretty formalized writing tone. And that was really it. I didn't expect anything to come of it. I didn't write it for Slate. I just wrote it for myself and posted it. This was at a very different time in social media and with the internet. I didn't expect
some might call it a better time.
I would call it a better time. I didn't expect it to reach that many people, but it kind of did, and then especially did when Slate published it. And that's ultimately what led to ESPN the magazine reaching out to me.
I'll get to that ESPN call or email that you got, but I'm curious, you mentioned that you started kind of studying football. Why did you kind of go that route just in your fandom? Why was it kind of important to you to not just watch the games and read about it, but you actually wanted to study the sport a little bit?
Yeah, I'd been a fan my whole life, but around that time when I started to have more time, I suppose, I wasn't in college anymore, I thought I'd like to understand this at a deeper level. I would also say there were writers at the time who I thought were writing about the game in a way that I found extremely interesting. Reading them, I felt like I was kind of cracking the code, and I would see things on the field and understand them, and I wanted to understand them better. People who use statistics too, which is just something I did in my regular job, but using that to understand the game better. And that was really it. It's kind of like anyone with an obsession or a hobby where you love it, but then you also feel like there's another layer to be understood. That was how I felt. football, I feel like, is a sport you could watch forever and still only understand a tiny percentage of it, and every year, or you could play it or coach it, and every year still learn, as you and I have seen, obviously covering the league. So I think that was just something that excited me, just being able to understand it on a deeper level.
When Megan Greenwell from ESPN reached out to you after reading your essay, what was just your reaction to that, to hearing from the worldwide leader in sports from an essay that you wrote?
Yeah, I would say flattered, but also a little bit unsure of whether or not it was even something I wanted to make a career. And perhaps more so than that, apprehensive about leaving, what I had been doing for the last 8 or so years. Just because I had felt I had built so much equity in business journalism, and I was building a real career there and kind of establishing a name for myself. So the idea of like switching to covering something that I loved was exciting, but also a little bit nerve-wracking because, it's kind of like making a sort of a soft career switch, because in some ways, obviously, you're still being a journalist, you're still writing features, you're still working for a magazine, but covering something entirely new was a decision I was kind of, went back and forth on a few times.
The podcast is called Breaking In, so we've talked about how you break into journalism, but I think it's worth talking about how you broke into sports journalism. Like, once you get started at ESPN, how do you just start from there? Like, how do you just suddenly become a sports writer?
This part was the easy part. The much harder and I would say more complicated transition was going from being a journalist to being an analyst, which is what I do now. Because going to being a writer for a magazine, I already was a writer for a magazine. I didn't need to learn how to write features. I just had to learn how to write sports features, which I think if I had gone to covering a beat or something, that would have been very much more challenging. But like you said, I was writing one kind of profile, and then I was writing another kind of profile. I had to learn some things like, how do you get in touch with agents? How do you work with teams? What's the calendar like? How do you get into a locker room? But for the most part, I found there were actually quite a lot of similarities between the kind of writing I was doing before and the kind of writing I did once I arrived at ESPN, which was primarily, almost entirely rather, doing features.
Okay, so then the next step, how do you become Mina Kimes, the NFL analyst?
A lot of people just have to bet on you for inexplicable reasons. There was a lot of steps along the way, and I think that transition, I was writing still, but writing less and less, and then doing other things more and more until at one point the lines just separated, right? First, I was talking about my stories on TV, which we all do at ESPN. Then I became a panelist on shows like Around the Horn. I was on Highly Questionable with Dan Le Batard, which are not like conventional, they don't have like NFL analysts. It's just opinionators, a lot of whom are writers. I started doing sports radio at ESPN. My very first opinionator job was doing a Sunday morning show. I would have to drive up to Bristol on Sunday mornings at 6 a.m. Then I did my own podcast, Mina Kimes Show featuring Lenny, which I launched about 8 years ago, which is a football show. Oh, before that, I was also doing regular appearances on my friend Bill Barnwell's show, who's somebody who played a huge role in my career, both in a litany of ways, honestly, and is someone I value really dearly. So at a certain point, I started writing less, and my job became more about doing TV and opinionating. And then in 2020, when ESPN rebooted NFL Live, which is my main show, it's 5 years ago, they changed my job title altogether to NFL analyst, and I stopped writing altogether pretty much around then. Yeah, I think the last story I did was on Justin Herbert in 2021, so I guess I did one more story. But it was, like a pretty big bet by ESPN for a number of reasons. I guess the most obvious one being I'm not a former player. But I think it's something that's worked out thanks in large part to the other people on the show who they surrounded me with.
I always ask people on this show for that through line from the beginning of your career to where you're at now. And yours I'm fascinated by, because what you did in 2010, 11, 12, 13 is so different than what you're doing in 2025. But what is that through line for you? What are some of the things that you might have learned at Fortune or Bloomberg that still matter in what you do today? Prep
with an eye towards communicating that prep and information and synthesizing it, I would say. When I was a magazine writer, I always, and this is not how, I was talking to Seth Wickersham, who's a colleague of mine, who's, a writer, about this. Seth just sits down and writes. That's insane to me. when I was a features writer, I would write outlines that were longer and more detailed than the stories. This is back when I was an investigative reporter, and even when I was just writing profiles. I mean, there are pieces I would write just like on my phone here and there, but I was very obsessive about organizing my thoughts and things beforehand. And I think that's something that's continued into what I do now. I just put together like exhausted, like long documents of notes and stats, and the process is pretty similar. And I do so with an eye towards, okay, how am I going to communicate this? How am I going to synthesize it? I think what I've had to learn is not to lean too heavily on that, because in television, you don't want to be over-prepared. You certainly don't want to be rehearsed. But I like to say, like, being on television, you just kind of want it to be the tip of the iceberg, where, you know, I'm on TV for, on average, an hour and a half a day, talking for like 15 minutes when you really think about it. But that 15 minutes is the tip of, you know, so much preparation. And I think that that's pretty similar to how I approach writing.
What was your welcome to the big leagues moment? Could be early in your career, could be at ESPN. I don't know how you want to, like, how you would define that. Different guests have defined it differently, but if, like, I just gave you that, you know, welcome to the big leagues moment, is there something that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think first time I started doing shows with former players, you know, I was doing shows with other writers and like Dan Levitard, who's a host. But the first time I started talking about football more often with former players, that was a real, like, wow, my life is not the same kind of thought. And you know, now it's easy, because now, like, the NFL Live is unique, and that's been the same cast for 5 years. You know, and those guys are like my brothers. But I think early on it was like a little bit daunting, right, to think about giving my opinions, and not only giving them but having to assert myself. So I would say that, you know, going to Combine and Super Bowls and meeting coaches and realizing they're watching our show and stuff is always kind of jarring. But yeah, definitely just being on TV with guys like the ones who I work with now.
It's so interesting, Mina, because I can't think of many people that have a less conventional path to where you are now than you've had, which is obviously a testament to your abilities and as you said, ESPN giving you these opportunities and trusting you, and people recognizing the talent and all that. Like, through that lens, though, what is your advice to people who are trying to break into the business? Because I do think there's a sense of someone could be like I could, you know, there's not just one path. I mean, is a great example of that. But also, you can't somebody who's just sitting there writing for Bloomberg right now might not be on NFL Live in 10 years either. So, like, through that, I'm fascinated by your perspective on it.
You know, I've never really looked more than one step ahead. Sometimes I think people's frustration, like, I've never really had a 5-year plan. I've never said, I want to be on this show and I have this title and this and that. I've always just really taken whatever opportunities I've gotten at the time super seriously. And when I look back, you know, I never would have gotten the opportunity to do NFL Live if I hadn't already been a panelist on shows and spoken really confidently about football on those shows. I never been a panelist on those shows if I wasn't podcasting and doing Bill's show and really taking those seriously with the prep. I wouldn't have been on those shows if I hadn't done that sports radio show on Sunday mornings, which I would show up with just an ungodly amount of fantasy football prep and use like a tiny, tiny fraction of it. I think sometimes you got to just see where your feet are and make sure you're on steady ground. And I think sometimes I get lost a little bit, especially early on when folks are trying to think, you know, further down the road. I feel like that is not always the conventional approach. I think some people will tell you got to really have a plan and think super far in advance. But my personal belief is that can get in the way of actually doing a good job at the thing that you're doing in the moment. And I believe most of my opportunities have flowed from one has led to another. None of this would have happened if I hadn't done the thing I did before and worked really hard at it.
Before we wrap up, because I like to end with something in the present. So I will ask you a Chicago Bears question, because I have a lot of Chicago people listening. I'll give you that in a second. I do want to go real quick back to your essay. Now that we're 11 plus years since that essay, which kind of helped launch this, I I was thinking as you were talking, that would have been my first or second year covering the Bears. They still haven't won a playoff game in that span. Just putting that out there for the Chicago listeners.
Cutler.
When you put in perspective that essay and where you are now, like, I don't know how often you think about it or how often, I know it's not only that essay, but like that was kind of the thing. Like, in what ways do you think about that moment in terms of where your career is at now?
I think that I don't think about it a lot, but since you're asking me to reflect on it, it was something very out of character for me, not writing, not what I wrote about, but the fact that I just published something on my own and kind of put it out there. At the time I was not really the kind of person who really put herself out there, which I realize is kind of what I do for a living now. And it was a bit of a risk, and I think I've become certainly less risk averse since then. And I've said yes to things I didn't feel 100% ready for much more often now. And I think that was kind of the start of that for me. It was less about writing about sports or transitioning to a different field or even being on television, but just kind of changing my willingness to take on risk. And yeah, that's probably like a turning point in my career in that regard.
All right, we'll end with the self-serving question. Chicago Bears. We're recording this in late July. It will probably run at the beginning of the season. So I've been trying to be a little bit evergreen with the question here. But what excites you or intrigues you most about the Ben Johnson, Caleb Williams?
Everything.
pairing?
I'm so excited. We're actually on site, NFL Live, for the Monday night game. And I could not be more excited. That's in part because I'm excited to go to Chicago in September and not like November. But yeah, I mean, it's just such a great matchup, right? And it's such a thrilling one to begin with. I am really interested in seeing how Ben evolves his offense, because I do not believe you can just copy paste. I mean, for a litany of reasons, probably first and foremost, different backs, different strengths, and the skill players are very different. The receivers obviously wildly different. But I feel like there has to be some evolution and really some. There's like a push-pull between him and the quarterback. Caleb Williams is so different from Jared Goff. He can still get under center. He can still throw play action over the middle of the field and do the Goff things. But his bread and butter is going to be different because his skill set is different. So I'm interested in seeing how those philosophies marry. Caleb, I really want to see him operating with faith in the structure of the offense. To my eye, that was the number one problem last year, is just it constantly felt like he didn't trust what was happening around him. And it's funny because I thought he would be fleeing the pocket a lot more like he did in college at times, but it was really just him sitting there and just looking like befuddled in moments. I think he's a smart guy. I think he's got obviously great talent. And if he can believe in what Ben Johnson is building around him, I think this offense can do great things. So I'm really interested in seeing both of those things and how they play out, because I think this is one of the more exciting and perhaps, NFL altering partnersties in the league this year.
Well, for intrigue level, I'm rooting for that. Obviously, this franchise beat me down a little bit over the years, but now you have a nugget where when you're on NFL Live, you could say something like, "Guys, I've been at ESPN for so long now, and the Bears still haven't won a playoff game since I've been here."
That's crazy, man. I lived through Bears fans yelling at me about Mitch Trubisky. I can live through whatever's next. I'm higher on Caleb, Bears fans.
The bar is a little lower for that.
Yeah.
But it's all part of the perspective. But it's I hopped on this podcast straight from practice. We saw a lot of Caleb Williams under center play action. Deep overs to Roma Dunze. So we'll see.
I heard Ben Johnson was yelling at Luther Burden. Was that fake news or?
Nope, that happened. You do have to be careful with what is out there. But
that's
yes,
believable. It was one of those things where you see it and I'm like, I watched Luther Burden in college. I believe this. And
yes. Yeah. He did have to yank Luther from a drill. So hopefully by the time this podcast airs, Luther is taken off in this offense. We shall see. Mina Kimes, you can listen to her on all of the podcasts and see her on ESPN. And I really appreciate you taking the time. This is a busy time of year for us. I can't imagine how many different things you had going on today. So thank you so much for telling your origin story.
Thanks for having me.